Hello, welcome back to Through the Trapdoor. I'm Emily.
And I'm Katie.
And this is our podcast where we read you Harry Potter fanfiction.
And this time we're going to start a new chapter.
Yes, this is chapter 12. Yay! If for any reason you skipped over the nonsense that was after our outro last week, you need to go back and listen because it was actually the end of chapter 11. Turns out it was only an extra, 10 minutes of reading.
Not even.
Whoops.
That's what happens when you start reading again on a phone and don't realize the last page is an author's note. We are very excited because we have our first nails date
I'm so excited.
Since Emily had the baby.
January. It's been since January since we've got to go.
I'm serious, because everything shut down. Because we didn't go that often together anyways.
No, we'd go every 2 or 3 months.
Right. So right around the time that we were gonna eventually go again, which would have been right before you had the baby.
Yeah, it would have been right at the end of March, beginning of April. Everything was already shut down.
Sad.
So we couldn't go.
Nope.
So I haven't been able to go since January.
I know. I went 2 weeks ago and I panic made my appointment and forgot to make an appointment for Emily.
When she says panic made, she legitimately means she panicked during the phone call and just accepted whatever they had and forgot that she wanted more than one.
Yep, that's exactly what happened. So I made the appointment for us at the end of my nail appointment so I could make it for 2 people and not panic. All right, are we ready for chapter 12, guys?
I think so.
Are we? Because we left on a cliffhanger.
Well, we're going to find out what happens.
I'm assuming that their parents are presumed dead.
I would assume so. Along with also her siblings, other than Petunia.
Oh my god, I keep forgetting she's got all these other siblings.
She had 2 other siblings.
Daisy and...
Dean.
Dean!
Alright, chapter 12. Dawn Incumbent.
Ooh.
Ah! Petunia shrieked again, and Lily blinked the intensely bright light out of her eyes and looked up, and then gave a fantastic start, which was understandable as a large purple bus had just appeared on the sidewalk and screeched to a stop with one of its front tires uncomfortably close to Lily's head. Hello, a cheerful voice. I say, what are you doing on the... Get us out of here, Lily shrieked, scrambling to her feet and yanking Petunia up with her in a mad attempt to board the bus. Hold on now, it's 8 shekels for... Impedimenta! Bellowed the voice of one of the Death Eaters. Crikey, yelled the boy, and he all but shoved Lily and Petunia onto the bus and ordered the driver to get away as quickly as possible. With a loud bang, the bus jumped from West Haven, someplace very far out in the country that Lily did not at all recognize. Here now, let me help you to your feet, the boy offered, holding out a hand for Lily, which she accepted gratefully, and rose to her feet with a small amount of difficulty, as Petunia was partly on top of her. However, as Lily rose, she noticed that her sister did not move. Petunia? Lily said. She crouched down next to her, and Petunia, who looked for all of the world as though she had fallen asleep, did not respond. I think she fainted, the boy offered, and Lily nodded. I think so, Lily agreed. Here, let me help you get her onto one of these beds. At this, Lily's head snapped up for the first time, and she looked thoroughly at her surroundings. She was on a bus, all right, but it wasn't like any bus she'd ever seen. Instead of 2 rows of crowded seating, there were instead 2 rows of rather comfortable-looking beds with nightstands to accompany them. As Lily and the boy lifted Petunia and set her on a bed, she saw that one of the beds on the bus was already occupied. What's the matter with her? Inquired the driver. Fainted, sir, the boy replied. Of course, she was being chased by Death Eaters. The boy's words were cut off as the driver jerked the steering wheel violently, and Lily shrieked as the bus drove off the road and nearly plowed into a tree. However, to her astonishment, the tree jumped deftly out of the bus's way, as did the next 3 trees the bus bypassed before the driver managed to get the vehicle back on the road. Don't say them sorts of things to me while I'm driving, Ernie, he nearly shouted at the boy. Sorry there, Frank, Ernie replied. I was meaning to say that I couldn't blame her for fainting is all. Lily happened to agree with him on that point and sank slowly onto the edge of Petunia's beds, hands shaking as It began to sink in exactly what had happened. "Well, miss, I don't know what you were doing with them people," the driver said, glancing in his rearview mirror, "but I'm glad you called for us in time." "Me too," Lily agreed, shaking, "though I'm not exactly sure how I did." "Stuck out your wand hand, of course," Ernie said. "Don't tell me you never heard of the night bus." No, actually," Lily replied sheepishly. "I'm afraid not." "Well, then," Ernie said, "welcome to the night bus. I'm the conductor, Ernie, and here's the driver, Frank. And for a small fee, we'll take you anywhere you need to go on land. Speaking of the fee, oh," Lily cried, realizing she didn't have a single nut to her name. She never had wizarding money during the summer. She never used it. Besides, there was no point in risking her getting wizarding coins mixed up with muggle money. "I'm sorry, I don't have any money. I mean, I have money, but it's muggle money. It's useless here, but oh, please don't send me back to where you picked me up. Oh no, we wouldn't send you back there," Ernie said, shuddering. "Wouldn't want to get caught going anywhere near those people." A nasty thought occurred to Lily. But what if the Death Eater... The bus swerved suddenly, and Lily jumped. "Sorry," she called to Frank. "I only meant to say, what if those people decide to summon the night bus themselves?" "Nah," Ernie said, waving his hand in a dismissive manner. "They wouldn't want to run the risk there'd be a ministry official on board." "Oh," Lily replied. "Well, what are you going to do with me, then?" "Well, we've never actually had this problem before, have we, Ernie?" "Not that I can recall. See, we usually just have a lot of people who pay before they get on the bus, and we've never had someone from that lot before, so..." Frank scratched his head in thought. "Where are you headed?" Ernie asked. "Maybe you can, when we get there, you can change your muggle money for real money and pay us proper." Lily replied, thinking she hadn't really thought of any specific place to go, except away from impending death and danger. But now she thought about it, she supposed she'd have to go somewhere, and they couldn't go home. Where could they go? She would have to have some way to obtain wizard money wherever it was the night bus took her, and then after she'd need a place to stay. But where was that? "Potter Cottage," she said suddenly and abruptly, surprising herself with the answer. After saying it, she thought about it, and for once something that had come out of her mouth before she'd had a chance to think about it made sense. "Dumb bloody relatives," muttered Bellatrix, shrugging out of her long, dark robes and ripping the Death Eater mask off her face, tossing it carelessly on her bed, or rather her and Siegfried's bed. They shared a flat in London, though not many people knew about it, and it was because of this convenient little detail that Bellatrix had decided to spend the night here, away from the prying eyes of her parents and the general public. After a night like this, Bellatrix didn't like having too much contact with other people. She usually either got the intense urge to kill them or confess her sins to them, and neither would have been good for the Dark Lord and his steadily growing entourage. She had spoken of this with Siegfried, and he'd assured her that she'd get used to it. He'd been a Death Eater for nearly a year and a half, and had overcome his own little idiosyncrasies, created by and associated with the job. He expected that Bellatrix would very much do the same.
Yeah, I don't think so. She is crazy.
Bellatrix's family, however, was a problem tonight, only because they had the unexpected visit of Andromeda and Bellatrix's extended stay with the Blacks. She'd even tagged along with Sirius to his little friend's house in a futile attempt to make nice with the Potters. She hadn't gotten very far, however, and in all truth had been lost wandering the house for most of the visit, thanks to Sirius and his very obvious plan to ditch her the moment the adults were out of sight. As such, Bellatrix had returned home late and nearly missed the meeting tonight. She was glad she hadn't. The summer was crucial in her time as a rookie. The more experiences like tonight were just what she needed to become as seasoned as Siegfried. Lily brushed her teeth, having obtained a toothbrush from Ernie, whom Lily suspected, in addition to trusting her to cough up the money once they arrived at Potter's Cottage, was taking a great deal of pity on her. The night bus rambled on, dropping off passenger after passenger, until Lily and sleeping Petunia were among the last passengers left. Lily avoided thinking about what she had just seen or anything that had just happened and focused instead on staying composed until she reached James's house. Ernie was admirable enough companion and proved quite successful in distracting her from her thoughts with a bit of rather mindless chatter. "So first time you've been on the night's bus, then?" "Yes, my sister as well. In fact, though I don't know what she'll think when she wakes up. She'll probably be utterly shocked at first. Then, once she's gotten over the shock, she'll be completely furious with me." "I don't see why she'd be too mad at you. You did save her from those, you did save her, after all," Ernie said, amending his speech in consideration of the driver. "Yes, well, she's never been too fond of anything magical," Lily said bitterly. You mean your sister's a muggle, then?" Ernie asked eagerly. Lily nodded. "Hear that, Frank? We've got a muggle on board." "Heard well enough," Frank replied, sounding rather grouchy. "I never took likings to muggles myself." "It'll be a strange night indeed, with that unpaid fare and a muggle on board." "Oh, come off it, Frank," Ernie said, waving away Frank's grumblings. "Don't mind him. He's just a bit touchy about the rules and all that. Not supposed to let people on board with unpaid fares. Not supposed to let muggles on board either, mind you, but none of them have ever come close to noticing the night bus, so there isn't too much worry there." "I suppose not," Lily agreed. "But I figured in times like these, you've got to bend the rules a little bit. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to end up in right sticky messes, and you won't be able to help anybody. And that's what we're here for, isn't it?" "So there you have it. I'm glad we got to you in time," Ernie said, sounding satisfied. Lily managed a weak smile and sat down on the bed next to Petunia. "Me too. I'm going to sleep. Wake me up when we get there." "All right, miss," Ernie agreed. "You sleep then." Lily crawled under the covers and laid her head down, listening to the humming and the occasional banging of the bus, the light snoring of her sister in bed next door. But she kept her eyes wide open, and she could not sleep. Lily felt a light tapping on her shoulder. "Here, miss," came the gentle voice of the conductor. "We're here." Lily blinked and frowned, looking up at Ernie, feeling confused. She hadn't thought she'd be able to fall asleep, not with all the thoughts she'd been trying to block out of her mind, but the bus had banged into Bristol, and a light rain started tapping against the windows, and a soothing sound must have lulled Lily into a shallow sleep. Petunia was awake, sitting up alert, noted, looking rather alarmed. "Lily," Petunia whispered, looking worriedly around the inside of the bus, "where the dickens are we?" "We're on a bus," Lily replied simply. "A magical one, and we've reached our destination, so let's get off then, shall we?" Petunia squinted, trying to see out the large, tinted black windows of the bus, but to no avail. "Off you get then," Ernie said, ushering them to the door. "Hope you had a pleasant stay on the night bus, and please remember, don't hesitate to call us if you're ever in need." Lily turned around after climbing off the bus and faced Ernie. "Just wait here. I'll be a moment and I can get some money." "Nah, you've been through enough tonight. I think we'll cover you." But Lily began protesting, but her speech was cut off by a loud bang, and the bus was no more. "I know where we are," Petunia whispered, staring up at the mansion that was so dubbed Potter Cottage. Lily walked to the front door and knocked on it with the large gold knocker, expecting Petunia to say more, but surprisingly, her sister remained silent. As Lily waited on the doorstep, all the emotions and thoughts and images she'd managed to suppress while on the night bus slowly began trickling into her brain, at first with the realization of what she'd actually witnessed. She didn't feel anything at all, just numb. The numbness lasted long enough for a house elf to answer the door, invite them in, and scurry off in a wild hurry to get James, at Lily's request. A horde of house elves soon surrounded Lily and Petunia, offering them hot tea, cookies, crackers, and even a bit of cheesecake, all of which Lily refused and requested that the house elves take away, as she felt if she had to look at any kind of food for more than a moment, she would be violently ill. She already felt ill enough without the plates of food being presented to her. A cookie was the last thing she needed. The house elves scurried off apologetically, and Lily shot a glance over at Petunia, who had her arms wrapped around herself and was shuddering rather violently. A house elf scurried over and offered her a blanket, which she refused, and she turned away from Lily to hide the sparkling tears that had begun to trickle down her face. This sight was almost too much for Lily, and she turned abruptly away from her sister to stop her own tears from flowing. She wanted to at least be able to tell James what had happened before she broke down, although now that she actually had time to think about it, How in the world was she going to be able to voice what had just happened without completely losing her composure? Tears began to well up in her eyes, and she suppressed them as best she could, knowing that if she paid any sort of attention to the enormous pain building inside her chest, or the teardrops threatening to spill over, she would quickly grow hysterical and be positively a useless, gibbering mess for the next several hours. The sound of footsteps pounded across the floor above her, and Lily gulped and wiped hastily at her eyes as the first few tears began to overflow. The footsteps bounded down the stairs and then quickly approached the front hall, and then the next second all Lily saw was James rounding the corner and rushing towards her, concern etched deeply on his face. Lily, he began, reaching out a hand for her. At that point, Lily could bear suppressing her grief no longer, and all the pain and anguish that had been building inside her for the last several hours exploded into sobs, and she fell against James rather unceremoniously. James, who was quite taken aback by this, steadied her and wrapped his arms around her, and then looked at Petunia helplessly for some kind of information. Petunia just looked at him with tears shining in her eyes and shook her head and burst out bitterly, "Can I just go to bed now?" James, who had a growing feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach, nodded at the house elves, who took the liberty of escorting Lily's sister to one of the guest rooms, where she promptly fell into hysterical tears herself. Lily, meanwhile, her face contorted in grief and pain, had latched her arms as tightly around James as they would go, continued sobbing. James decided that speaking would be utterly useless at this point, so he simply held her against him and tried to be as soothing as possible, although really there was not much he could do. "Hold me tighter," Lily commanded between sobs, which startled James, but he complied, and Lily buried her face into his chest further. She was still sobbing, but it had lessened somewhat, just enough so she could barely speak between sobs if she really wanted to. "Don't let go, James. Please don't let me go." "I won't, Lily, I promise," he whispered, rocking Lily gently from side to side. She sobbed and shuddered and tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. "Shh," James said soothingly as he could to her. "It's okay. You don't have to talk right now. It's okay." Lily buried her face as deep into James's shirt as it would go, and sobbed for another several minutes, still shuddering like mad, her knees quaking, threatening to buckle. James scooped her up into his arms and carried her, still sobbing form, out of the front hall and into the main living room. He set her down gently on the couch and sat next to her, where she promptly latched onto him again and continued crying. He rubbed her back gently and stroked her hair and made several other soothing gestures, but began to feel rather silly as none of this seemed to have any effect whatsoever on the hysterical Lily. She didn't protest, however, so he continued, hoping to bring her whatever small amount of comfort he could. After several more minutes of sobbing, James heard soft footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see his mother coming down, tied in a large blue bathrobe and looking extremely tired. "Mom, it's okay," James whispered. "You can go back to bed." Mrs. Potter frowned. "It is most certainly not okay, not with the poor girl carrying on like that. What happened?" James shook his head. "I have no idea, but I'm starting to think I don't want to know if it's this bad." Mrs. Potter shot a look of sympathy in Lily's direction, even though Lily was not looking. "The poor dear. I wonder if maybe she'd like some hot tea." James shook his head. "It's kind of hard to tell, but I doubt it." Mrs. Potter sighed. "Perhaps you're right. I think I'm going to go busy myself with making some anyway. I'm awake now, and worried, and I need something to do." "Would you let me know when she's well enough to talk?" James nodded, and Mrs. Potter disappeared into the kitchens. Lily did not compose herself for quite a long time. Mrs. Potter made 2 pots of tea before the crying succumbed, and Lily hiccuped herself away from James's chest slowly. House elves immediately supplied her with tissues, which she accepted gratefully. James's shirt was now wet with tears, but he didn't particularly care about that. He cared about Lily. After blowing her nose thoroughly, Lily gave a weak sob and collapsed against James's shoulder rather limply and cried gently for a few minutes. The house elves ran and got Mrs. Potter, and by the time she arrived with tea, Lily had nearly composed herself again, although her face was red and blotchy and her eyes were very puffy and the tears were still shining in her eyes. "Here, my dear," Mrs. Potter said kindly, "have a cup of tea." Lily shook her head with a pitiful look on her face and leaned against James. After a moment, James craned his neck to look down at her, and the expression on Lily's face had changed. And now she did not look pitiful so much as she simply looked lost, unsure, uncertain. "Lily," James whispered. Lily looked up at him, dazed, forlorn sort of expression on her face. James racked his brain for a moment, trying to think of exactly how he was going to phrase the question. He couldn't very well ask her if she was all right, as she most certainly was not. And it didn't seem very fitting to ask if she was going to be all right, as that didn't seem very likely either. James sighed and stalled for time, brought his hand to her cheek and wiped away tears gently. Quite unexpectedly, Lily grabbed his hand and held it in both of hers and simply stared at it. He looked at her, feeling very confused, and waited. "Do you see this hand?" Lily asked after a while. "It is solid, it's warm, it's real, I can touch it, I can hold it." James looked at her, studying her face as she spoke. She simply stared at his hand, her face expressionless. "Imagine if you were holding a hand, James, and you let it go for just a minute, and then you turned back to grab it again, and it was gone. Imagine if all that real and solid and warm to you just suddenly disappeared. Imagine if you could never ever hold that hand again." She looked up at him, eyes pooling again with tears. "What if you lost 4 hands in one night, James? What if those hands belonged to your family? What would you do?" At this point, she burst into tears again and fell against James's shoulder. James, with horror, began to piece together what she'd said. Grotesque images flashed through his mind as he imagined dozens of scenarios in which Lily's family was taken from her, and his arms tightened around her reflexively. "I am so sorry, Lily," he said, with as much feeling as he could. But he felt stupid for saying it, as there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He didn't even notice his mother, who was looking at Lily with shock and horror and sympathy, and burst into tears of her own. They weren't nearly as loud as Lily's, nor as anguished, but they were heartfelt. She gasped, "I'll go. Tea." She ran into the kitchen. Lily, after having spoken all that she felt was necessary to speak, simply cried. She cried for what seemed like forever. But if the length of her sobs was agonizing, it was nothing compared to the potency with which she dispelled them. James had never heard anybody cry like this before. Like their entire world had just been ripped out from underneath them. Like everything dear to them had suddenly been taken away. Like they were drowning in despair. Lily did not try to reserve a single tear and sobbed as loudly as she wanted, to the point where it made James want to cry too.
"James, it's okay. You can cry too. That's fair."
Yes. James normally did not cry, and when he did cry, it was in private and very quietly so that no one knew about it. But there was something too tragic about having someone he cared about so much lose everything they held dear, and he could not hold his sympathetic sorrow in, and his tears slipped slowly and silently from his eyes. Lily and James held their pose on the couch early into the morning hours, until Lily was exhausted from crying and anguish. And James could not keep his eyes open any longer, and they both fell asleep, Lily curled tightly against James in a desperate attempt to find comfort, and their tears dried silently on both of their cheeks. The morning was properly rainy and overcast, so James and Lily did not wake immediately when the sun rose behind the clouds. They lay sleeping for many hours past sunrise in the gloomy gray haze of rainfall, looking, despite what terrors might have been haunting their dreams, very peaceful. Mrs. Potter found them laying entwined like this at about 1:30, much earlier that morning. And after having gotten over the initial shock of seeing her teenage son sleeping with his arms wrapped around a teenage girl, felt a swell of sympathy for Lily, and decided not to disturb them. Instead, she covered them both with a warm blanket and let them sleep. You witnessed her coming into your house and sobbing for hours. Why would you just not assume that they would fall asleep together on the couch?
Seriously. Like, I would be so unsurprised that they were asleep on the couch like that. Like, you literally were, like, watching her cry into your son's arms.
Yeah, like...
all night.
Yeah. I would assume that was all that would continue happening until they both passed out.
Right. Because, like, I'm sorry. Crying is exhausting.
It really is. James's father, however, did not have such a calm reaction to finding Lily and James curled up on the couch. For one, when he had spotted them, he had just come home from putting in long hours at the ministry and was very grumpy and tired. For another, the angle at which he saw them was an odd one because the blanket tucked around their sleeping forms covered everything except for two legs, one of which was James and one of which was Lily's, both of which appeared by some accident to have the socks or pants being pulled off and completely bare.
Oh, you were missing a sock and just, like, half your ankle was showing? I'd be like...
what is happening under this blanket?
Why? What? Could you just imagine, like, knee down? Two teenagers, and all you can see is one leg each knee down, and that's it. And it's just a naked leg from the knee down. You'd be like, what is happening?
But, like, I feel like you often lose socks when you're napping on the couch under a blanket.
And your pants somehow end up all the way up your thigh, and I'm like, did not know this was possible with these pants.
Yeah. And you're just like, I'm so uncomfortable. How did I sleep like this for who knows how long?
Because when you nap for too long, you lose track of what day it is. Like, I've woken up and go, I've missed my bus. I've been out of high school for 11 years and haven't taken the bus for 11 years. And sometimes I wake up and go, fuck, I missed the bus.
Yep. You're like panic. You're like, oh my god, what time is it?
I'm late for work. Nope.
The minister, Magic, upon seeing his teenage son sleeping on the couch with a bare-legged girl, gave a fierce shout, an action which there were several various reactions. Several house elves came scurrying in to see what was the matter. James's eyes flew open in alarm. Lily awoke with a start, and she shrieked very loudly and sat up, causing the blanket to fall away, and revealing to Mr. Potter, with much relief on his part, that she and James were in fact fully clothed. This, however, did not completely dispel the minister's shock, and he bellowed at his son, James Christopher Potter, what do you think you're doing? James looked as though he was unsure how to answer, and Lily glanced back and forth between James and his father very quickly before deciding to speak. It's my fault, she announced suddenly and automatically, and Mr. Potter fixed his gaze on her. I came here last night, and my family, Lily trailed off, and the look on her face suggested to James that she was just now remembering the events of the previous night, and she hadn't actually said it out straight yet, and didn't know if she could handle it. A lump rose in her throat at the thought. I'm sorry, she finished lamely, her voice much less stable. James covered her hands with his, looking at his father. Last night, he said, finding it hard to pick the right words for this. You know there was an attack. He tried to avoid saying it so he wouldn't upset Lily, but he glanced at her and felt a pang of despair. 2 steady streams of hot tears were already running down her cheeks, although this morning Lily's sorrow was silent. The minister's face changed completely. It was first white, then red, then white again, and then somewhere between red and white, and etched with sorrow and regret. I am so sorry, he said, on behalf of the ministry, on behalf of myself, I am sorry. Lily didn't speak. She just nodded weakly, and when the minister had gone, buried her face into James's shoulder.
So I think that definitely confirms her entire family is definitely dead.
Yes. The hours were agony. Lily hated being alone. She was torn between trying to block out everything entirely and dwelling on it until there was nothing left to dwell on. The emptiness of losing her family consumed her completely. She couldn't take a step down a hallway, take a bite of food, even take a nap, with thoughts of her family flooding her brain and spilling out of her body in the form of tears. Sometimes the tears didn't help at all. Crying, after all, couldn't bring them back. James was with her constantly, always trying to soothe her, always holding her or comforting her, and in some small, distant part of Lily's heart, she was very aware that this meant the world to her, but she felt as though there was this whole hollow place inside of herself that James could not fill, that he couldn't even begin to touch. And because of this, all the comforting in the world could not appease her sadness. Petunia never once left the spare room in which she had been put by the house elves that first night. The house elves brought her food, but she did not eat. She refused to speak to anyone, and as of yet, Lily did not feel she was in any state to try and communicate with her sister. Lily wasn't eating very much either. Everything she ate either made her throw up or want to throw up, so she steered clear of most foods. Just about everything she ate reminded her of her parents, which didn't help any, so Mrs. Potter ordered the house elves to start inventing dishes in a desperate but vain attempt to pique Lily and Petunia's appetites. After the first day, the minister was out of the house far more than he was in, and even when he was at Potter's cottage, he did not sleep, he worked. If he did sleep, Lily didn't know when. During her second day, the minister came back to the cottage after spending several hours at work, and brought 2 wizards with him. He took Lily into the room and introduced her to the wizards, who turned out were oars, and their names were Sullivan and Knox. Sullivan and Knox and the Minister of Magic asked her questions about the night her parents died until she cried again. Knox gave her a handkerchief and a pat on the head as they left, and Sullivan conjured her a little flower, but it didn't help. They hadn't meant to make her cry, of course, but it happened anyway. The third night at Potter Cottage, Lily decided that she better try to sleep on a real bed, as both she and James were getting odd creaks in their back from sleeping on the couch, and Mrs. Potter was getting to be less understanding about it. I feel like she wouldn't be getting less understanding about it.
Yeah, I also don't feel that way. I mean, yeah, don't let them, they're sleeping on the couch in a public space. They're not, going into a bedroom and closing the door and, cuddling.
Yeah, and, clearly Lily is in too much of a despair to do anything.
Literally except for sleep and cry.
Yeah.
Let's be real.
Yeah. You can't even get her to eat. You're making the house elves invent dishes. I don't think anything further than her laying on James is going to happen.
Right, and legitimately sobbing into him.
Yes. They gave her the same spare room she usually slept in, but the second she walked into it to go to sleep, she felt suffocated. Even here, where there were so few memories of her parents, Lily was overwhelmed by the thoughts of them. Of her first day at Potter's Cottage, and then Christmas here, of Dean here.
Dean.
Lily choked on her sobs and turned and fled the room. She flew down the hallway and through the house blindly until she was far away from the bedroom as she needed to be, and then curled up against the wall and cried. It wasn't long before she heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and someone sat beside her, and Lily looked up through a sheen of tears and saw James' blurry form. His hair was even messier than usual, and after swiping her hand across her eyes, Lily could clearly see that there were massive circles under his eyes. "Go back to bed," Lily said, not wanting to deprive him of any more sleep. "No," James argued firmly, insistently. "Not while you're here like this." "You need to sleep," Lily choked. "I wasn't sleeping, and I won't be able to sleep if I leave you now. Come here," James said, and Lily did not feel she was in any state to argue. He pulled her against his chest, and she cried until her sobs wore themselves out. Lily's stomach and chest and throat were beginning to ache. She'd been crying too much and too often. Her eyes were swollen and irritated, although quite proficient now at producing tears. She hadn't seen a mirror in days, but if she looked half as bad as she felt, Lily expected she'd had much more of a general appearance of a troll. Her body was beginning to wear itself out. Lily felt exhausted both physically and emotionally, but mostly the latter. James was also exhausted, but refused to admit this to Lily, as he felt that he should be as strong as long as Lily was still a mess.
Well, that's very sweet, James.
That night was the last that Lily spilled her tears into James's arms. For inexplicable reasons, after that point, things with Lily began to change. Gears began to turn in her mind, and she was flooded and overwhelmed with thoughts. Thoughts, 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 so many thoughts. So many thoughts that Lily could not stand to be around other people with them. And she had the house elves locate a spare room for her that she had never seen before, and she locked herself in and thought. That's a lot.
That is a lot. A lot has happened.
All right, well, we will see you next week with
more of a lot.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining us on our journey through the trapdoor.
You can leave us a review on Facebook or Apple Podcasts. It would literally mean the world to us.
Or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at thetrapdoor16.
Or if you have any longer thoughts, you can shoot us an email at throughthetrapdoor16@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
See you next week.